Interesting story, actually. When I attended the first conference at Stanford in 1994, I met so many different teachings. Now, I had attended workshops before that, but the diversity was very noteworthy. Some said we had wings, one person said we didn't. They didn't all use the subtypes. So I thought, as I was certifying with 3 different teachings, programs, certifications, I thought I really wanted to know more about the types. So I was due to start my certification work in January, and the conference was, I believe, in maybe June. It was in the summer for sure. And after that, I started informally researching what people would say about themselves, and then I followed up with interviews. Now, I came to this having worked many years as a manager and needing to be able to interview someone quickly and effectively and place them in the right positions so I didn't have to hire new people and train all over again. And to reduce my amount of travel. I was a manager by the age of 20. Eights can seem age progressed at times, and they couldn't ask actually how old we were. It was just an interesting time. Long story short, I'd already studied microexpressions. I already knew archetypes. I already knew body language. I already knew Karen Horney's work, and I could go on and on. So I was already interested in systems. Myers-Briggs, I had certified with Myers-Briggs many, many years ago, but when I found the Enneagram, it was like the mother lode, and I wanted to know everything about it. But when I kept seeing these variables with people of the same type, I wanted to understand more why. And I began with that questionnaire that you all have seen if you've taken the test at katherinefauvre.com or Enneagram Tritype test.com. And that original questionnaire is what I learned to do in business as a result of an intensive in the 70s. And I can't even find it anymore, or people ask about it. But those first, the 5 adjectives and the strength and the weakness came from that work. So I already had years of having it cut through what people thought they should or shouldn't do, or their behavior, and what they'd actually choose for themselves. Now people know of my work and they can kind of look up words that they like better. That's not quite the same as that raw experience. So if you are going to take the test, when you answer that, answer it like you would have long before you knew the Enneagram. You'll have a more accurate understanding of your particular dynamics, because I'm now doing the machine learning. So the words will indicate type 2 and how they come together. Right now it's 8 tests in 1, but you only get the results for 7 of them. I'd like 100,000 tests before I say more about that, because over time I've learned that you really need a large body of work to break it out. 27 instincts, 27 tritypes, etc. With that first body of research, I noticed 2 things: that there was stacking order to the instincts. We didn't use just one, which was taught when I learned about the Enneagram in 1985. I learned about the Enneagram before there were a lot of books. There was a book written, but it wasn't in the bookstore. Most people didn't know about it. But it was the original book was written in 1984. So if you think about it, had I been in the right place at the right time, or perhaps through a Catholic church, if they sold a book, that's where it would have been, because it was written by 2 priests and a nun. And it was a very simplistic view, but it was the beginning. But the main book that came out, books plural, that came out like at the very end of 87, Don Risso's book came out. And the very beginning, January of 88, Helen's book came out. Then the Enneagram was more accessible to everyone now. Helen had the subtypes, Don did not. He had not been taught the subtypes. And Naranjo said, he didn't know enough at that time, and that he came up with more, and that actually he'd known the Enneagram only 8 months when he was already teaching it. This is what Naranjo told me. And it works out actually from when that first Eureka training was and when he learned prior to that 1970 training. So I also noticed, and it stood out even more, was that the instincts were stacked, yes, but so were the centers. Because I couldn't explain why people would have the core fears. That's a whole body of work I did long before the Enneagram. I just added it because when I was managing 1,000 people, I was trying to use anything to help people grow and change. And looking at that facet of your core fears and your idealized image matched the Enneagram. There were just a couple that were a little different. But when I was doing the 3-hour inquiry process with the people who had filled out the questionnaire, and I noticed that they might identify with one or more types that they had no access to, no line of connection, no wing, so no possibility of being that critical. And I thought, well, at first I thought, well, maybe type isn't as clear as I thought. But then over time, it was repetitive patterns, the same core fears coming up with people that answered like the same 3 types. And I go, wow, this is pure gold. But I couldn't get anyone to talk to me about it. I called it Tritypes and Tri-Center. I used it with my clients immediately, but the other teachers just said, no, you notice things, Katherine, that I don't. It's not that they were disinterested. They just didn't know the Enneagram that well to notice those things. They also weren't doing thousands of interviews. You'd have to want to do that to begin with. So when I noticed that, I thought, wow, if I work with people, and I did, with the 3 types, not just the one, you still want to know what type's in charge. But the 3 types together create a type unto itself. So if I could work with people based on the lead type and how their type is modified by the other 2 types that they have, the other type from each center, or as Ichazo called them, instinctual triads, then I could give them better strategies for managing what their dilemmas were or their obstacles. And once I knew those 3, the improvement that people reported, the transformational aspects just went way up. So if you've gotten anything out of studying the Enneagram, then knowing these 3 types just is like putting the key in the lock, or 3 little keys that open then this big lock that then opens more. Eventually in 1996, Jack Labanuskas and Andrea Isaacs had the opportunity of interviewing Oscar Ichazo, and he mentioned to them that he used Trifix. And they said, well, they had kind of focused their interview on other things that he hadn't really gone into it. But there are a couple paragraphs in, I believe it's either the end of 96 or January of 97, where the concept of Trifix is introduced. Problem is that nothing about the individual ones or what it was based on. So right after that, I attended a morning session for the IEA in Northern California. And they happened to have a teacher from the Eureka Institute, Ichazo's school. And she was teaching Ichazo's psychocalisthenics, or the concept of it, because it was just a 3-hour morning session. But she happened to mention her Trifix. I go, wait, I got to learn about this. She probably knows more. So at the end of the morning, I went up to her and said, tell me about Trifix. I have found that people use 3 different centers, and it's so consistent now with thousands of people that I know there must be something to it. Can you tell me where I could get more information. And she said, no, she just learned about it, that he had talked about Trifix in terms of each center and the fixated belief of characteristics of each center, triad, as he called them, and that the answers we wanted, the questions actually that we wanted answers to. And he just started telling people there are three. Now, they didn't discover for themselves the way we do. Ichazo determined everybody's type and then later Trifix. And Naranjo did the same. But we, not having Ichazo and Naranjo readily available, the first books were not written by them. We tried to do it ourselves, which is good, but there's always an area we're not going to see something important, or we're going to have a different definition of the types depending on who we've studied with. I had the good fortune to have the 3 certifications that were available in 95 and to spend a long intensive with Naranjo and later with Ichazo, as well as Ichazo's teachers. So I was able to find out what came from whom and when. They evolved because it wasn't known, not that people were trying to mislead anyone. Just like integration, disintegration was an error he never intended to go around. It was an idea that Naranjo, in this case, thought might be meaningful in an evening study group. And in the same evening, he said, no, it can't work because it's dialectic. It has to be trialectic. You go to both lines positively when you're integrating and negatively when you're disintegrating. But that second part did not go out. Robert Oakes disseminated it with one direction positively and one direction negatively. So that's normal. Those things happen. But that was fascinating for me to discover that Ichazo had come to realize that everyone used 3 types, not just one. And that's what I had found. So it was very exciting. There just wasn't anything I could get on it because he had published nothing on it and had said very little to his students. It just wasn't available. But I wrote like crazy, so it got out there, but it was my finding. People think it's one and the same. So if someone says your head fix or your heart fix or your gut fix, that means fixation only. Or they may be using Ichazo's terms incorrectly. This was according to his attorney and the people on his board that I met, that he had never taught individual Trifix, as I mentioned. But when he did, he was recognizing that everyone had to use all 3 because otherwise we were not equally able to go to all 3 centers. So the 2, the 4, the 5, and the 7 had no connection. 5 and 7, no connection to the heart. 2 and 4, no connection to the head. That would be almost half the types not having an equal connection, and 2 and 7 in particular. So when he defined them, he was looking at the fixation. So when I met with the Oregons, it was really important to separate our work because everything that was out there that was being given attribution to Ichazo actually came from me. People just didn't realize it because when I found the work and that he also saw these 3 types, I made the assumption that it was the full type, the way I had found, not just the fixation, but the fixation, the passion, and the conviction of each type. And as a result, as I was working with more and more people, I was just saying things about the tritypes and calling it Trifix. So I just didn't want to confuse people by adding something totally different, because where we were the same is that we both found that you use 3 types, 1 from each center. And that's pretty much where it ends, because he's just the fixation. I'm the full type, and all the research has been based on my work. So I have found out a lot more than I did in 1994. And I didn't really even formally teach it as a class. It would be in my study groups. I called it Tritype in 2007. I was teaching it before that. But when Ichazo's attorney that was on his board came to my training, she said, Katherine, you've got a whole testing way of looking at this material, and you know things about the types that I didn't even know. She identified with her version. They had very much wanted to trademark Trifix, but I had popularized it. It was being given to me, and I thought, well, no, that I'm happy that you keep that. You can do that. I will change back to what I had, which was 3 types and Tricenter. And she goes, no, we've all talked about it. And we think it'd be much better if you called it Tritype, because you're both on to something really important that no one else knows. But he's talking about the fixation only, and you're talking about the full type. I loved it. I went and wrote a little notification right then and there. I said, you're right. Okay, I didn't know that. And they didn't know things to tell me about Trifix because they weren't taught about it. They also told me that I should trademark it. Fascinating question, because I assumed, again, that it would be easier to find someone's type than their tritype, but it's just the opposite. There's something kind of inherently within human nature that we don't want to narrow things down to like one thing. We won't claim one thing until we have a lot of knowledge. And I tried it in businesses where I began with the instincts, or I began with then Tritype or the types. And the one that worked the best, where people would get to their type the fastest, was teaching them to choose one from each center. And then it was very easy for them to then narrow down to the lead. If you start out the other way around, there's too much that happens in the process of identification where you have already identified with the type you think you are, so you can no longer have additional information. And yet, what Tritype is identifying is that you do have a lead type in each center, but you cannot base it on behavior or identification as the answer. It can lead you to the hypothesis, but you have to see what happens when those 3 types come together. And this is another way Tritype is not fully disseminated accurately. So I'm an 874. Now, what does that mean? It means I have the 478 Tritype, and I always begin with the smallest number whenever I'm talking about the archetype. So anybody that has the 4, the 7, and the 8, regardless of the order, there's 6 variables. You could be 478, 874, 847, any permutation of those 3 numbers. The types come together, and this would be true every tritype. Whatever they share in common is amplified, and it's a greater driver than type alone. So you will actually identify more with people that share the same tritype than you will someone of your own type with a different tritype. Now, why is that? It's because you use the same rationale for your thinking processes. You have the same kind of heart needs, if they're the same, and your visceral knowing the same as well. And then if you're the same instinct, no question, and the same instinctual stacking. Now, I hoped for this wonderful system where we could rank the 3 instincts, and we could rank and stack the 3 types. And then, like, I would be a sexual 8, and then I was trying to figure out, okay, I'd be social 7, and then I'd be self-pres 4. But it doesn't work, because my It does on a more advanced level. Wouldn't it have been nice and easy and just so formulaic and here, just get this and then this is what happens when the two come together. But instead, what I learned is the instinct is more dominant than type. Now, in 1985, all the way till I did my research, it was believed that the instinct was just this minor quality. Even Naranjo called it perhaps with people with a strong instinct, a mini passion, that it acted like a mini passion. Well, later, when he and I talked about it, he was thinking, well, okay, if you have this stacking, then that would explain if someone had a strong identification with one of the instincts, then they would have that mini passion that he was talking about. But if people didn't, and so the reason I added stacking in the very beginning, it was how those three types came together and the order. And I used to always just reference the first two, like I'd be sexual self-pres. And to me, social was implied that was last. But a lot of people took it to mean that the first two were important and determined the instinctual stacking. Not so. Same with Tritype. The first two, if they're close, they're really close and the other's lower, then it's harder to determine which one's in the lead with your instinct and with your Tritype. But if you recognize that you have one very dominant, you're going to have no trouble determining your instinct. In fact, when I was teaching at the Federal Reserve Bank, if I was teaching the infrastructure, I taught in every division of the bank over a 15-year period. The people who worked in infrastructure, those were the walls, the piping, everything in the bank. They were primarily self-preservation. And you can see how that would go hand in hand, a visceral type, and they were gut types, usually not always, but they were gut types and they were self-pres. And boy, when I went over the instincts, they knew I'm that one, right away. Now, the self-pres 6 might think that they were an 8. It can be hard. But I guess the key thing is, what does a beginner need to know? And that is, begin with what you think you might be, but in no way do you limit yourself to that. I've spent a lot of money putting into effect a testing instrument that accounts for what 3, 6, and 9 do in testing. And they're identified with balance. They're the center of each center. But because 3s know they want to be successful and they know they're driven and they know they want to achieve, do, what's next, they end up having a very good success rate on knowing they're 3. There are other 2 types in the Tritype. No, that takes them a longer time because they're still seeking balance. Now, 6, on the other hand, they're the opposing force. The 3 is the initiating force. And because they're the opposing force, they always see 2 sides to everything. It depends on the situation. And they will think they're an anomaly if they're type, but actually, what happens with 3, 6, and 9 is because they're seeking balance, it's like they don't exist. They take on the shape and the feelings and associations of the more dominant type in their Tritype. And by that, I mean, you could lead with 6, for example, but you could have 8 in the Tritype. You might think you're an 8 simply because the 6 becomes counterphobic whenever 8 is combined. So, it really, really gives important nuances of the inner workings of your defense strategy. It's extraordinary how quickly you can get to the heart and soul of what someone needs to affect the change that they want. Did you learn about type first before you learned about the instincts and how did you learn? Like if people learned online, they'll usually say 8 wing 7. But when you're speaking it, it sounds like a 7 with an 8 wing. But what's intended is type 8 with a 7 wing. I used to always sign that I was an 8W7 because I didn't want to type it. I don't really type. So that's why I didn't do all 3 instincts. That's why I didn't write a lot of things. So it's a labor of love to write them. I think wherever you come in is fine, but just observe how you actually defend, not what you do. Because 6 and 9 and 3, but in particular 6 and 9, will identify with a type that's a characteristic that they have. If they're really achievement oriented, they'll think they're a 3. If they're emotional, they'll think they're a 4. There are really 9 types of 6 and 9 types of 9 and 9 types of 3 at first glance. All the other types there are 9 types of, because your tritype modifies your type. That's the other way we can work with tritype. So the first is whether we're looking at it chronically or not makes a difference. So that's why I said I may be an 8-7-4, and what I'm communicating to you is my dominant type is 8, then 7, then 4. But that takes time to observe, especially that third one. And you have to have feedback from other people because we just don't realize how critical that is. And you have to have Ichazo and Naranjo's definition of a type. So sometimes we won't see things based on whether they have the instincts or whether and who they learned from. Huge difference. It's been 50 years at the Enneagram, 51 this summer, that it's been disseminated and there's more and more information, but there are 4 different ways that it has been transmitted. I have a little bit of that written at EnneagramTritypeTest.com. So whether you learn from Ichazo or from Naranjo or from one of their people, stay open-minded. And that's why I've spent so much time, energy, and money, because I've really wanted to help the 6s and 9s that mistype for 10, 20 years. But they never really land. And unfortunately, type 6 was not fully disseminated. There's much more to type 6. It's the most emotional type. People don't realize that. So if they're emotional, they think they're 4s because emotion was given to the 4s. And 4s aren't more emotional. They're identified with their emotions and their negative emotions. Whereas the 6 is going emotion, emotion, emotion. The 4 is going into a mood. And then they're staying with that mood and they're creating a persona on their mood. Now, if someone has 6 and 4 in the tritype, it's very hard for them to determine the lead. But I encourage you to find out as much as you can about the actual defense strategy of the type, not the behaviors. Behaviors lead us astray. They're only the starting point. Anybody could be opinionated, but what are they opinionated about? And more importantly, why are they opinionated? Is it because they're insecure, so they have to hold on to their opinion? Or can they throw an opinion out here, there, no problem? That's very different. Those are 2 different people. And knowing the energetic stance of each type, the body language of each type, the way they use the muscles in their face is hugely different. I just happen to have done those correlations, like with micro expressions. And actually, for what it's worth, Ichazo taught proto-analysis, and that was how he determined type. And he would take a face and put it up on a big screen and look to see where tension was carried in the face. And that was be indicative of type. Well, I don't know if he was exposed to Paul Ekman's work. He probably came across it. He was an incredible scholar. Ichazo, he had inherited an incredible library. He was an avid seeker of information. So I don't know, but I happen to have learned micro expressions long before the Enneagram. And the way he taught 8 was you had to see tension here. And disgust, which is a primary emotion, is like we smelled something bad. And eights use disgust so much that they really develop the muscles here. Like if we really work on a muscle, it gets bigger. And sixes, I can't even do it. They can have one eye go up and the other go down or move and reverse it. And the reason being is that sixes, as they're thinking the opposing thought or feeling, they're looking up, no, maybe, yeah, what? And it's so they've developed all these muscles. And so people often say to sixes, do you realize that I know what you're thinking, even if you are trying to conceal it? But we don't really know what they're thinking. But we have an idea when they're questioning, but we don't know their ultimate judgment. I've had to work with many managers that think their sixes are disapproving when they're delivering something new. And I go, no, it's just their thinking. Well, what if I made this mistake? Or wait, what if that happens? So all the facial expressions were not meant to undermine the leader at all. It was just six going through the process of figuring out how they were going to implement what was new. So there's so many factors. I have things online. I have one called Tips on Typing. I have a course, Nuances of Type, where I go more deeply into the aspects. Well, 3 weeks worth. But I have a handout that you should be able to find online. So once I saw stacking with empathy styles, then I just knew that was many, many years ago, that they're stacking to everything. And for energetics, you take any system and you can correlate it to the Enneagram. But with the Enneagram, it's the only one that is based on motivation and not behavior. All the other personality typologies, you look at behavior. So I would throw that out for beginners too, that it's going to be a natural tendency in the defense strategy and go underneath whatever you thought it was and find out what you might have been feeling. I do it with of course, when I'm doing the in-depth inquiry in a session with people. I do a little bit in the assessment for the typing, the test, to help people begin to see, yeah, it's really not this, but this, or your language is really that of a 3 and 6 and 9 rather than a 3, 6, and 8. With the 4, 7, 8, that tritype, 7 is the creative of the head types, and the 8 is the creative of the gut types. So if you have all 3 creative types, you're going to need to keep moving and creating and following new information. Whereas if you are 4, 5, 8, then that tritype is creative with the 4 and the 8. But what happens is 5 and 4 are withdrawn in their push-pull, in the way they pull away. 4 emotionally, 5 psychically, they don't want entanglements. So that dramatically changes the difference between 4, 7, 8 and 4, 5, 8. Once you realize what is canceled out and what is amplified, it's much easier to find your type. You can get to any of it via katherinefauvre.com, or you can go directly to the test, which is a different website, which is Enneagram Tritype test.com. I teach all year long. Right now I'm teaching Tritype, going into a 10-week course following that of Tritype 2, which is more advanced, and then I'll have a 3 and a 4. But I'll probably weave in some other courses. And the other thing I do actually is, beginning with COVID, I just realized that if people didn't understand the actual definitions of the types, or if they saw panels but they weren't being taught types at the same time, I decided to do a teaching panel. I did these first couple panels, and now I've decided just to carry on because people learned things they didn't realize about the types. I never had a chance to study with Ichazo or Naranjo. They may have had good teachers along the way. I certainly did. Don and Rusty, Helen and David, Ted and Kathy. But right now, Rusty's the only one still teaching. And he's a very scholarly guy. And if you guys know Almas, he first learned about the Enneagram from Naranjo in those early sessions and went on and did his own diamond heart work. So one way or another, the Enneagram has been huge influence on all of us. You know, the thing I forgot to add too with Tritype is there are wings. For something to be true with the primary types, has to be true in Tritype, and it is. And there's all these advanced secondary ways you can know which Tritypes you use and which order, what you use the least. It's a rich body of work. Take it in at this level or just keep expanding out.